We should be in a position to leverage the lower tariffs for our export gains, particularly if we are facing barriers in the US market. Of course, the question of scales will come into play, but even if we are confronted with some internal constraints, I am optimistic that our producers and exporters of wearing apparel will find ways of getting around these constraints in order to leverage the huge opportunity which the UK market uh, is likely to provide to us after the FTA starts getting implemented.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. My guest is Abhijit Das, former head of the Center for WTO Studies, and we're going to talk about the FTA with the UK, which was finalized only yesterday. Abhijit Das, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Surya. It's always a pleasure to be back on your program.
Your thoughts on the FTA, initial reactions, what do you think?
First and foremost, we need to look at the FTA in the larger contemporary context. At a time when President Trump has started his assault on global trade rules, when his actions have created huge amount of uncertainty, here we have two large economies, UK and India, coming together, finalizing a trade deal after 3 years of very difficult negotiations. So it does give us a glimmer of hope that
Mhm.
despite the contemporary problems afflicting global trade and trade rules, large economies can come together, can join hands, and finalize deals which would be in their mutual interest. Having said that, we will have to await the fine print of the legal document to really make an assessment of where the two countries stand in terms of concessions made, gains accrued, and the likely overall economic impact.
Mhm. Tell me, if Trump hadn't happened and all that disruption hadn't happened, would the same urgency have characterized the dialogue between India and the UK for an FTA?
I would stick my neck out and say no.
Hmm.
It is partly thanks to Trump that it injected a sense of urgency in both UK and India to conclude the deal. No doubt the two countries have been negotiating for close to what, 3.5 years, but
Yeah.
there were difficult issues which were hanging fire. What Trump's arrival at the scene and his subsequent actions have triggered is a sense of pragmatism, a sense of urgency, that even if we are able to finalize a deal which may not be very ambitious, which may be a little lower in terms of what might have been our expectation, it's better to strike such a deal sooner rather than later. So, to that extent, I think the two countries may have to give a bit kudos to President Trump for having concentrated their minds and making sure that the deal is finalized at the earliest.
Would you say the pressure was more on the UK or was it us?
That is very difficult to say. I think the pressure would have been on both the parties, given the fact that India was in a position to face higher reciprocal tariffs in US compared to UK. From some perspective, yes, the pressure might have been more on us, but at the same time, given the fact that India is such a lucrative market for UK might want, relatively speaking, a first mover advantage compared to both European Union and US. So they might have felt encouraged to come to some sort of deal with India at the earliest.
Mhm. So tell me, what are India's gains from this FTA? What do we get?
Let's bear in mind that customs duties in UK are already much lower than in India.
Yeah.
almost half of our exports enter UK market duty free. So the incremental benefit in terms of UK eliminating tariffs might not appear very significant. But if we look at sectoral level, then one sector which is of tremendous salience for Indian economy in terms of exports and in terms of jobs is textiles and clothing. And in
Yeah.
UK for the clothing sector, the tariffs are anywhere between 11 to 12%, which is close to four times the average. So once those tariffs come down to zero, it would certainly offer us a significant export advantage. And it's up to us to take benefit of that export advantage. So textile and clothing will be a sector of our benefit. Similarly, leather would be another sector where our exporters in merchandise trade stand to gain, and even gems and jewelry. On the services side, that's an area where India, in various FTA negotiations, has traditionally had a very, uh, I would say, a positive, strong, positive agenda. And in the FTA with the UK, what we have heard and what we've read in the media are accounts suggesting that the two countries have either finalized or are close to finalizing an agreement which will allow Indian workers to who work in UK for up to 3 years to make social service contributions just in one country, namely India.
Mhm.
This is likely to enhance export competitiveness of Indian workers in the UK, particularly in the IT sector. So that really is another area of very substantial gains for us.
Mhm. You mentioned that the UK tariffs were low, and Indian textiles in particular. You mentioned that will we be able to take advantage of the lower tariffs now in play in an area like textiles, for instance?
We should be in a position to leverage the lower tariffs for our export gains, particularly if we are facing barriers in the US market. Of course, the question of scales will come into play, but even if we are confronted with some internal constraints, I am optimistic that our producers and exporters of wearing apparel will find ways of getting around these constraints in order to leverage the huge opportunity which the UK market uh, is likely to provide to us after the FTA starts getting implemented. This will, of course, not happen immediately.
Yeah.
Implementation of the FTA could happen anywhere between 9 months to 1 year down the line. So our manufacturers and exporters do have that much of a lead time to get their acts together.
Mhm. Just as an aside, I've been reading in the papers about how Indian textile exporters are on the back foot when it comes to competition from even Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Is that correct?
Yes, that is largely correct. And one of the reasons why our exporters are on the back foot is because of the tariff advantage which Bangladesh gets by virtue of being an LDC in the European
Mhm.
Union. It gets access under something called everything but arms, which is a zero duty access. So, to that extent, they get a 12% benefit over us, and similar considerations would apply to UK as well. So partly the advantage which some of our competitors gain over us is on account of tariffs. Another reason, of course, when it comes to India and Bangladesh is the question of scale. Bangladesh
Mhm.
has a large number of factories which employ more than 5,000 workers, whereas very, very few factories in India would have workers more than 5,000. So while Bangladesh is able to leverage economies of scale, we are not.
That's
But
really
I
odd, isn't it? Them having bigger factories than ours. Very strict.
Yes, certainly that is a bit of a problem which should have been addressed years ago, if not decades ago. But uh, we have to face the reality that confronts us today. But the point here is ameliorative action needs to be taken both by the government as well as the exporters themselves.
I was reading through the government press release last night about the FTA, and there was a mention of Indian machinery and so on and so forth. Now finding a market in the UK. Is that substantial? Does that make up for huge chunk of, assuming we can compete in that area?
Uh, yes, they would be a substantial proportion, but overall, in terms of potential for growth in our exports, the momentum will really be led by wearing apparel sector.
Uh-huh. I see. And what about stuff like gems and jewelry? It keeps coming up. Is that so important?
Gems and jewelry is definitely important, but there we need to make one fine distinction. The gems and jewelry that we export, be it to US, be it to European Union, be it to UK, it has relatively lower domestic value addition and hence a relatively lower contribution to our GDP, to employment generation compared to wearing apparel. So,
Mhm.
for the same value of exports of gems and jewelry and wearing apparel, the contribution of wearing apparel to the GDP and also to employment may be substantially higher than gems and jewelry.
So, strictly to products made in India, do we gain there also? Other products?
There, the story is a bit mixed,
Mhm.
particularly because when it comes to government procurement, they're going by the accounts that have appeared in media, particularly the UK media. It suggests that India has made a substantial concession to the UK in
Mhm.
terms of opening up its government procurement market at a level which is deeper than what we did for in our FTA with UAE. In our FTA with UAE, we did have some carve out, some exceptions for Make in India program.
Mhm.
It appears that uh, some of those carve outs have been abridged rather, have been curtailed to provide almost a level playing field to UK producers, service suppliers in government procurement market, even in areas covered by Make in India. Now, this is not a blanket carve out for UK suppliers. There are conditions attached to it. But fact remains that we have consciously given some market access in government procurement. Now, the extent to which that will erode Make in India remains to be seen, but the apprehension is certainly there that at least to some extent, Make in India might take bit of a hit. It may not be very substantial, but
Mhm.
uh, at least some hit it might take on account of the concessions that we've given to UK. Now, the story doesn't end there. We are also negotiating with US, we are also negotiating with European Union. Now, what
Yeah.
we've offered to UK thereafter becomes the floor in these negotiations.
Yeah.
They would expect much more,
Mm. Much
and
more.
they are likely to expect much more. So,
Mm.
having opened the floodgates in India, UAE, FTA provisions on government procurement, we really now are at a situation where incrementally we may have to grant more concessions to our subsequent FTA partners in these negotiations.
What about issues like environment? Is that being a part of this FTA?
Yes, issues around environment are a part of the FTA. And there, what is important to bear in mind is that uh, there is a link with government procurement here,
Hmm.
and the link is that in our path to a low carbon economy, we would certainly require equipment for renewable energy generation,
Yeah.
and some of this will be through government procurement. And here, if we are going to be giving a non-discriminatory treatment to UK, then that might, uh, in a
Upset
way,
the.
upset the possibility of
Yeah.
creating a vibrant domestic industry in this sector. So that is the link between environment and government procurement. Going, of course, we have to await the fine print, but going by one of the documents which was put on in the public domain by the UK government yesterday,
Hmm.
there appears to be an endeavor to facilitate and promote trade in environmental goods and services,
Hmm.
and also some sort of commitment. I don't know to what extent it is a hard commitment or it's a best endeavor commitment for goading the two countries to adopt relatively higher standards of environmental protection. So these are some areas where environment does come in the picture in the FTA between India and UK.
What about that carbon border mechanism? Does that?
That that of course is literally the huge elephant in the room. The tariff concessions which UK has promised India, some of
Yeah.
those can get undermined if the UK ends up imposing carbon border adjustment measures against India's exports. Now, we have not seen anything in the press releases after the announcement yesterday on this issue, although a couple of days earlier, some news items had appeared talking about a rebalancing mechanism.
Hmm.
So we don't know where the two parties stand on this issue. And from India's perspective, this is going to be very crucial. If this issue is not resolved in a fair manner, then there is a very high possibility that the market access that might otherwise be available to Indian exports in the UK, some of it could really get eroded, and we may not be able to fully exploit the potential which this FTA may have for enhancing our exports to UK.
So is this still under negotiation, or negotiations are over?
We don't exactly know
Uh-huh.
on this issue. The press releases from both sides are a bit uh, ambiguous on this account, whether the negotiations have been concluded
Hmm.
and what is the status of the issue around carbon border adjustment measure. So we'll really have to await further developments, further disclosures by the two governments on both the content of the outcome as well as, very specifically speaking, what they've decided in resolving this issue of carbon border adjustment measure.
Hmm. Any thoughts on the gender issue? Is that also at play here?
Again, if we are to go by what the UK side has put in the public domain, there is a reference to gender, which is about enhancing opportunities for women to access the full benefits of the FTA
Hmm.
and advance women's economic empowerment. How this will be done, what are there hard obligations on this, or is it a broad objective which thereafter will be pursued through committees under the FTA, remains to be seen. But it's very clear that this agreement is likely to have provisions on trade and gender.
Hmm. And in the event of a dispute, where does it? Who decides? Who's right, who's wrong?
There is a dispute resolution mechanism which has been indicated, but how the disputes will be resolved, those detailing will will be clear once the text is available. But normally, the dispute resolution mechanism normally has three members. How they will be selected? Maybe normal one practice is each side nominates one, and the two nominate a third person. Maybe that could be one approach. Another approach could be having a list given by both sides, and then through draw of lots. We don't know what mechanism will be eventually instituted, but definitely there will be detailed provisions on dispute resolution in the FTA text.
In your experience, you've been involved in trade negotiations and you know the area well. In the FTAs that we have signed with the UAE fairly recently, um, has India been able to take advantage of it? You think it has benefited us more, or
If we look at just the merchandise exports, and
yeah?
that's where much of the attention gets focused, because that's an area where data is not difficult to come by. In most of our FTAs, our exports have grown, no doubt about it, but our imports have grown much faster to the partner country. And the
Yeah.
reason is not far to seek. The reason lies really in the relative tariff structures, whereby Indian tariffs are much higher than the tariffs of the partner countries with whom we have signed an FTA. So, naturally, when both sides bring tariffs to zero on substantially all trade,
Hmm.
the partner country gets a much higher tariff advantage compared to what India gets in the partner country. So it should come as no surprise that our imports from the FTA partner country would see a much larger growth than our exports. So this, in a way, is almost a given in our FTAs. But what we also have to bear in mind is that some of the FTAs have seen investment inflows into India after the FTA started getting implemented. Whether those investment inflows can be directly linked to implementation of the FTA is a larger question. Maybe the two trends were coincidental. That is, FTA starting getting implemented and investment started coming in. We
Yeah.
really do not have a detailed study of that, but different FTAs have shown different patterns, and it's very difficult to join the dots and come to one conclusion that FTA led to investment or
Hmm.
FTA did not lead to investment. It's very difficult to come to that conclusion. And another point on trade trends, which I wanted to highlight, is that even if our imports have grown after implementation of the FTA, we really need to decompose the inflows in various categories. Did
Hmm.
imports of raw material, parts, and components increase? If it did, then that would have enhanced our competitiveness of downstream manufactured product.
Yeah.
But if imports of finished goods, consumer goods increased, and if we did have a domestic industry of a similar product, then maybe our domestic producers were edged out of the market to some extent by imported products after the FTA started getting implemented. So the picture really needs a very disaggregated analysis.
What about imports from China? We have, I think, levied a lot of anti-dumping duties on China. Is there a danger that the Chinese could be sending goods via the UK, or that's improbable?
That I think might be unlikely given the distances involved,
Yeah. Hmm.
and hopefully the rules of origin which are included in the FTA will prove to be robust enough to prevent China taking advantage of the FTA between India and UK and rerouting its consignments through UK.
Hmm. Abhijit Das, if you think FTAs are the way to go forward.
Here, what we have to look at is what is the contribution of an FTA to increasing our exports. We have
Mhm,
to keep that on one side. On the other side, what we have to look at is to what extent have we given up our policy space to make those gains in exports.
mhm,
And once we have both the sides in front of us, then it becomes obvious that the gains from exports through an FTA
mhm,
really might not appear to be very impressive.
mhm,
And we might have ended up conceding considerable policy space in areas of future, for example in digital sector or in sector of green goods and green technologies. I'm not saying this specifically in the context of UK because we do not have the text in front of us
yeah,
as yet,
yeah,
but as a general principle, the likely increase in exports on the one hand may not be sufficient to offset the extent to which we would be curtailing our policy space in sectors of future economic growth. So that comparison has to be done to come to a conclusion whether FTA is the way to go forward. To my mind, if the objective is to boost exports, which clearly will be the objective,
yeah.
another possibility could be to make sure that transaction costs within the country are reduced, costs
Mhm,
on account of bottlenecks at the ports are reduced, costs which arise on account of infrastructural deficiencies, these are reduced. So there can be multiple ways to enhance the export competitiveness. It need not be only through the mechanism of lower tariffs. In fact, if we were to get our act together on some of these issues related to costs of doing business, transaction costs, costs on account of infrastructural deficiencies, maybe the boost to our exports may be much more significant than the boost which we might get from FTAs.
mhm. Is this recognized at some level in government? I mean, I'm sure after decades of, looking at these trade issues, this is a realization that will be there.
I'm sure the realization is there within the government that FTAs will bump up our exports, no doubt about it. But the real boost will come from addressing our internal constraints.
Yeah. Mm.
But the two are not mutually exclusive. They will go hand in hand. But the trick will lie in making sure that the boost which we get through exports, the on the other hand, it should not end up in the FTAs tying our hands very, very rigidly to implement catch up policies in new and emerging sectors.
Mhm. Last year, we signed an FTA or some kind of an agreement with four European countries. I think Liechtenstein and a couple of others.
EFTA countries, Switzerland,
Yeah,
Norway.
yeah. Any word on how that has worked? I mean, it's probably just about a year since it was signed.
Early days, very early
Mm.
days on that. We will have to await a few more years to come to a conclusion. And there in that FTA, what will be worth keeping an eye on is the promise of the EFTA countries investing.
Yeah,
I think the
billions.
figure is $100 billion over a span of 10 years or so.
Yeah,
So if that happens, then that is something very, very laudatory. But we will have to await and see whether that really happens because governments won't invest. It's the private entities who will
yeah, yeah,
invest.
yeah,
And when will a private entity invest? When they uh, see possibilities of making profits in India.
yeah.
Those opportunities no doubt exist. So as I said, we will really have to just await how this implementation of the EFTA FTA unfolds over the next few years, and then maybe we could come to some conclusion.
Mhm. Any thoughts on the EU FTA? This thing has been fast tracked, and now you think the EU is next? How could the US be first?
Difficult to say which will be first, but I would stick my neck out and say perhaps US may be earlier than EU because hopefully number of issues involved in US may be more limited compared to European Union. That is
Uh-huh.
one, and there are two linkages between the UK FTA and the EU FTA. One aspect I have already mentioned earlier, which is that whatever we've concessions we've given to UK, EU is likely to expect at least that much in some areas. And
Mm-hmm.
second, since the agreement with UK has been almost finalized, that would goad European Union to become more pragmatic, give up some of its long-standing demands, become more practical, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe sign the final agreement with India sooner rather than later. So these through these two channels, we might see some influence of the India-UK FTA having been finalized.
So, last words, Abhijit. We have finally struck gold, it would seem, with the UK FTA. Two more on the horizon. There's some talk of an FTA even with Peru, I understand. Is that serious?
Well, Peru used to be the land of gold once upon a time,
It
but
still is.
honestly speaking, the economic justification of an FTA with Peru perhaps is not as strong as the economic justification of an FTA with some of the larger markets. But having said that, an FTA with a developing country is always welcome
Mhm.
because the possibility of difficult non-trade issues in those FTAs are much lower. And another benefit is, particularly in the Peru context, India and Peru have very similar positions on issues around biodiversity and
Mhm.
patents and traditional knowledge. So, this FTA, if it includes provisions around what is called the TRIPS and Convention on Biodiversity issue, then that is
Mhm.
an important way of creating norms in this area.
Mhm.
But
What?
apart from that, uh, in terms of real bump in exports, I do not
Mhm.
envisage that happening in after an FTA with Peru is finalized and implemented.
Mhm. So, last question. What you're basically telling me is that charity begins at home, and one, we should carry out structural changes within our own economy if we want to capitalize not just on FTAs but exports otherwise. And perhaps we should focus more on our own immediate neighbors in terms of liberalizing trade and all that.
I completely agree with your first point, Surya. On the second point, one has to take a bit of a more nuanced approach. We
Hmm.
should certainly have strong trade links with our neighbors. That can also be a channel for security and stability in the region.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the immediate neighbors might
Hmm.
not be that uh, huge
Amenable.
a market for us, not from the economic perspective, not that big a market. So we really have to look both east as well as west. The benefit of looking east is less contentious issues in FTA
Mhm.
negotiations. The
Yeah,
problem in looking west is we get saddled with TRIPS plus issues on the IPR side. We get saddled
yeah.
with the labor issues, environment, gender, whatnot. So
Mm.
we
Hmm.
have to really see how best to move forward. But absolutely, completely aligned with you on the first point that While we may look at FTAs as a means of improving our export performance, the real bump in our exports will come when we make internal reforms.
On that note, Abhijit Das, as always, great talking to you. And you've given our viewers a good perspective on the UK FTA and, of course, FTAs otherwise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Surya, for having me on your show.
That's all we have for you on this broadcast of The Gist. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media. Thank you very much. Good day.